Hi, and welcome to another exciting episode of What the Orbit. I'm Lisa.
And I'm Jeff.
And today's guest is Bob Hall, Space Data Center Operation Manager.
Hi there.
Hi, Bob. We invited Bob on the show today because Bob not only has an interesting background, but he's just a cool guy.
Can confirm.
Thanks.
So, Bob, first we want to get to know you a little bit. In reading about your background, you have an interesting story of how you got to where you are. You were a satellite operator, correct?
Yes.
So for our folks out there, how does one become a satellite operator? In college, you don't check a box for satellite operator as a major in school. It's aerospace engineering, typically. Can you tell our listeners, how do you take a path to become a satellite operator?
Well, I do think, as you mentioned, aerospace engineering is probably the best discipline to go into because, as you say, there's no spacecraft or spaceflight operations undergraduate or even graduate discipline per se. But aerospace engineering is probably the best all-around preparation for that, with a strong sense of programming as well. And then with that foundation, I think that's the stepping stone to get into a lot of spaceflight operations jobs.
When you come out of school, what do you look for then? What do you apply for if that's what you want to do? I know Jeff has a funny story because this is what you wanted to do.
Yeah, so I wanted to be an operator growing up, and the only satellite operations I knew of was like what was going on at NASA, what was going on in the military. So I joined the Air Force to try and do it, and still didn't get that assignment. So I've never been a satellite operator.
Oh, really? Never?
Never.
Nice.
So do you look or to apply for something when you get with an organization, or certain areas that you kind of lean into?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of opportunities out there now. Now, of course, the other thing we see in operations today is increased percentage of automation, but there's still an operations team. And I would say with time, we see more and more companies flying satellites. So the opportunities are out there.
Private companies.
Oh, yeah. Now, I started flying satellites for the U.S. government, but there's opportunities out there. There's so many private companies flying satellites today, and there didn't used to be. You just got to look for them.
Yep.
Interesting. So today, because of your background with satellite operations and flying satellites, we want to talk to you about debris, specifically debris in satellites. We hear about that all the time. We pulled some stats first. Recently, we learned that there's roughly about 4,500 operational satellites and close to 3,000 dead satellites. And with regards to debris, according to NASA, there's 23,000 pieces of debris larger than a softball, about 500,000 pieces of debris size of a marble or larger, and about 100 million pieces of debris smaller than 1 centimeter. Having said all that, and satellites going into space, and now people even venturing up into space, how come we don't hear about more collisions and more things being hit in space?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One, we're experiencing this age of rapid growth. So for decades, we're in this mode of, while there are objects up there, space is fairly big. So even though the number of objects sounds large, given the volumes involved, there weren't that many close encounters. Over time, that has changed. We've seen collisions. We've seen ASAT tests that create all kinds of debris. And the other thing we've learned in talking with spacecraft operators, there have been instances where operators see signs that their spacecraft got hit by something. Perhaps it was too small to have been tracked, so there's no trail leading up to it that says, oh, here's going to be a conjunction. But based on a lot of evidence, when we got these operators in a closed room, several of them started to say, oh, yeah, we had this instance, we had this instance. But as you can imagine, when you're a publicly traded company, you don't want to be telling everybody, oh, my spacecraft got hit. Now, I'm not saying it happens every day, but the point is there have been instances of this.
So were these potential collisions that you think may have happened, these are collisions that did not like catastrophically destroy the satellite, is that correct?
Right. Which also supports the theory that it was probably, small debris, too small to be tracked, caused some minimal damage, either temporarily or permanently disabling that one satellite. And like I said, we've seen evidence of that.
Have there ever been any major collisions?
Oh yeah, there absolutely has been major collisions. In 2009, there was a collision between two spacecraft. One was operational and one was no longer operational at the time, and that created a lot of debris that we're still dealing with in the LEO environment.
What led up to that? Did the satellite not see it?
Well, satellites are not looking ahead. They're not like a pilot, in the air who can see air traffic coming or has a TCAS system that warns him, which way to go to avoid it. there are ground systems that monitor things the best they can, and then try to predict where things will be and provide those warnings. Those systems are less accurate than we would like, especially back in 2009 when this collision happened, but they're still not as accurate as they need to be. And the other thing that happened is, because the information was the accuracy wasn't there, it actually turned out that the spacecraft involved was doing some routine maneuvers. And so in the about 10-ish hours prior to the collision, the spacecraft did maneuvers. So unknowingly, they essentially moved into the path of this dead satellite, catastrophically so.
How often in spacecraft operations do the operators do maneuvers to avoid potential conjunctions?
That's difficult to characterize, because a typical ConOps or operations concept is that if an operator is aware of a conjunction that gets to their own threshold of action, and each operator has their own threshold, a lot of times what they'll do is these spacecraft often have an operational maneuver profile, meaning they have to maneuver from time to time anyway to perform their mission. So a good approach that many operators take is that if I need to do something to adjust for a potential conjunction, I factor that into my normal station keeping plan so that I can kind of do what I need to do, but in a way that avoids a conjunction, and therefore not do a maneuver that is just an extra maneuver and therefore maybe waste fuel, which translates to life.
Now, with satellites, and I equate this to cars, if you're in a satellite accident, let's say you were to hit another satellite, do you have insurance on you? Is there insurance agreements that you might have to pay for somebody else? Is that same similar concept in space as it is on the ground?
I do know that satellite operators often get insurance. I'm not familiar with the details or the rules of the road like you're talking about and how that would play out. I'm not really the guy to talk to there. Okay. Sorry.
And
there are people who specialize in insurance for the satellite industry. Absolutely.
What about, when we talk about debris, is it evenly divided out amongst the Earth's orbit? Or, like the ocean, is it segmented in certain areas?
Well, there's two pieces to that. One is, what is the actual debris population? And the other one is, what is our knowledge of the debris population? I would argue that our knowledge of the debris population in LEO, low Earth orbit, is better than our knowledge in GEO. Just because of the sensors and the sensing technology, presently, we, as mankind, we can detect smaller things in lower orbits than we can in further orbits. So we have the size, ostensibly we can get down to a smaller size in LEO than we can in GEO. But then when you mentioned those population numbers before, the lion's share of satellites and active satellites and debris is in low Earth orbit. Yes, many satellites go up to GEO, but even there, a lot of times you'll have a spent upper stage that sometimes crosses through LEO. So LEO is where most of the debris is, not all. I mean, the GEO operators have to avoid the debris issues as well.
Why is most of the debris at LEO? Is it just where more people fly?
It's where most of the satellites are. It's where more of the upper stages are. And among other, we've also had, let's see now, 1, 2, 3, 4 ASAT tests by various countries.
Can you explain what an ASAT test
ASAT is an anti-satellite weapon. And at least 4 different times a country has performed an ASAT test, and each time that's a destructive, well, in these cases, I'm talking about destructive tests. So the country has chosen a target, usually of their own, and they've purposely destroyed it to test out their ASAT capability. But when you do that, you create a lot more debris in LEO. That's always in LEO. There's never been an ASAT engagement, for destruction at GEO. So when they do this at LEO. It creates more debris. Now, it doesn't always stay up there based on in LEO, depending on your altitude, debris will tend to decay over time. By atmospheric drag, will drag the stuff down to the point where it re-enters. If your orbit is low enough to begin with. If your orbit is higher, that orbit altitude decay due to drag could take decades. But if you're in the 300 to 500 kilometer range, it doesn't take decades. It acts much quicker. So in some cases, there was one country that did an ASAT test, and it was much higher. So most of that debris is still on orbit being tracked. In addition, the collision I talked about was in LEO. That created thousands of pieces of trackable debris. That's all in LEO. So we've had these events that have kind of polluted the LEO environment even more. And just recently, the Russians, they were the last of those 4 I was referring to. In November of 2021, they did a test. So the interesting thing there is when the Chinese did their ASAT test in 2007, like the world was admonishing them, like this was a really bad thing to do for the space environment, for everyone's use of space, and presumably lesson learned for everybody. But here, just 4 months ago, Russia did it as well. So it's kind of a head scratcher. Yes, they want to validate that their weapon works. And it's actually causing problems, at least for the next year and a half, 2 years, for a lot of LEO satellites, the debris from that Russian test.
You say it's caused a lot of problems. In what way? They have to dodge it?
Well, maybe. It is certainly causing large number of conjunction warnings because of the orbit that the target the Russians hit was in and the target that a lot of Earth observation satellites are in, and the way those two kind of compare to each other. We're in this mode for 2022 where the debris is kind of sweeping past a lot of Earth observation systems for 2022. So it doesn't mean it's going to hit, but it means operators may be inundated with lots of conjunction warnings, and now they have to spend mind share to figure out what do we do about it. Do we have to maneuver or not?
By conjunction, you mean close encounter?
It's like a close approach warning. The software on the ground has said, hey, if I propagate your information forward 2.5 days and 1.5 days and 4.5 days, whatever it is, in the next handful of days, you're going to come within 5 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 1 kilometer of this piece of debris. And like I said, each operator has their own threshold of pain that will cause them to act. Some operators may be comfortable kind of riding out a conjunction of 5 kilometers, some not. And it all varies. And it's based on, how good is the information that's driving that in the first place.
Have we seen over the course of time any change that you can identify in like ConOps of satellite operators? I can imagine the nature of this is, I can imagine like if you get more and more of these warnings, it almost becomes like the boy who cried wolf. Like you keep warning me things and it never comes true, so I'm going to ignore or filter out. Have we seen any kind of change in ConOps as to they do start to ignore things, or maybe change their ConOps so that they only react at a different level than they used to?
I'm not entirely sure there. We don't tend to get a lot of visibility. Companies are sometimes fairly closed about how they tend to operate their systems. But I do know we've had conversations with folks in the past where when the information just becomes overwhelming, it does have that effect of they tend to ignore it and hope for the best, which isn't what you want.
So I've heard of a thing called Kessler syndrome that has to do with collisions happening in space and creating so much debris that it basically propagates around the world and just creates more and more collision. Can you talk a little bit more about that, what that means?
Well, yeah, that's certainly something that's been discussed now for a few decades as to whether we're going to get into the Kessler syndrome, like this gloom and doom situation. But the interesting thing, and I was reading about this recently, interesting thing is, I think when we read about that, we all assumed that there was, if you could plot stuff on a graph, there would be a no-kidding inflection point, like things were okay, and then things were just definitely horrible. Like, oh my God, like whatever happened yesterday, now the Kessler system is. And more recently, I've been reading, like, it may be a more gradual process. I'm not saying I necessarily believe this or not, but what this article was proposing is that we may be living the gradual slide into that sort of situation now.
Is that fixable?
Well, it is fixable, but we got to do something about it kind of yesterday. And one is we got to start by leaving a lot less debris on orbit and stop generating debris with destroying satellites. That's just insane. We have to start by leaving a lot less debris in orbit, number one. So re-entering stuff when we can. Number two, we have to be able to passivate things. So let's say it's an upper stage that I can't re-enter. It drops the satellite in space, and there's no way for me to get it to re-enter. You have to have ways to passivate it, to empty the tanks, make sure the batteries have no power, reduce or eliminate all the potential things that 5 or 7 or 12 years down the road could result in explosion of that stage, because that has happened over the last 50 years. And then the other thing we need to do, and like I said, these collisions and these ASAT tests create lots and lots of small debris too. That's really hard to deal with. But the other thing we can do, and there have been studies made looking at the debris population of where the debris is and how big the debris is. And so there are some folks who do assessments of, they kind of grade things, and based on not only the orbits but the size of the debris, they can kind of grade what are the top 5 or 10 or 20 pieces of the debris that present the biggest risk. And really what we need to get to, which we've been talking about this, it seems, for at least 10 years, is some sort of debris removal programs, and they seem like they're happening much more slowly than we need, but there are some happening. So you've seen in GEO, you've seen MEV has gone and done some service life extension of satellites, the Northrop Grumman MEV, that could just as well, when that satellite's life over, tug it to the the super sync belt and just drop it off in the debris area. So that could work, could do the same thing. And the Chinese actually did that with SJ-21. They took an old dead satellite that was left in GEO because of the way it failed, and they tugged it out of the way to the debris area. That was great. We see Astroscale doing some of that testing right now in LEO. I think they're in the middle of their testing program. So that's the type of thing that we need to have operational today. Now, when you do that, you run into other areas. So Jeff, you had a launch, and you launched a satellite, and you left an upper stage on orbit. You're flying your satellite. You don't necessarily care about your upper stage, but it's your country's upper stage. Mm-hmm. So now I come along with my cool, innovative company and say, hey, that thing is the biggest risk to the space population. I'm going to tug it out of space. Now I have a potential legal issue because it's your debris, it's your upper stage, not mine. And I don't know that we as a community have hammered out those details yet.
So when you think about when you started out in your career to where technology has just grown and developed over time, how do you think the role of a satellite operator has changed? Do you think it has gotten more complicated because the information has just become more overwhelming? Or do you think with all the AI that has started to be involved and come into play that it has helped an operator? Or has it become more challenging also because of the sheer volume of other objects in space and the amount of additional objects in space?
I definitely think there has been a shift more and more towards automation, whatever that automation may include. So you have some commercial operators where a handful of people on the staff are flying, dozens of satellites. You have other operators.
Was that the case back when you first
Well,
started?
it depends. It also depends on the organization. My experience on the government side was they were not in that mindset. It was much more, I don't want to say hand-holding, but it wasn't like a 1 to 70 relationship, which sometimes commercial operators can do. Because different purpose, different missions, right? And then we see some operators now really leading the way, and they have some onboard automation that they upload conjunction information. The satellite decides when to move. Now, I don't know how that works when, if you move to avoid a piece of debris, did you just move into the path of another piece of debris? I don't know enough about their systems, but that's the sort of thing we're starting to see now with that sort of innovation. Because when you have a fleet of 2,000 satellites, it's too much for somebody to get their arms around. You need the information rolled up to you with a lot of smart software, whether it's on the ground, in the air, whatever, and then you do what you need to do to manage the fleet.
We wanted to ask you one wrap-up question. We want to get your final thoughts, Bob, if we may. If you could recommend one change for the space industry, what would it be?
I think given where we are with a lot of the situations we're dealing with, we really need much better understanding of the environment. So people talk about space traffic management, space traffic control, and if you draw analogies to the aircraft world, where there are controllers in towers telling pilots what to do, there are systems on the plane that will automatically talk to the other plane and avoid each other, I don't think that's going to happen for a very, very long time. But what needs to happen is we need much better understanding of the environment. Where is the debris? Where is it going? And I would say that today we're still using systems that are decades old, built for a different purpose, a different world. And really what the industry needs to do is to really quickly adopt or take advantage of the pace of commercial innovation to tackle some of these problems, to get much more exquisite space situation awareness knowledge of the environment. Because with knowledge, then we can make good decisions.
We thank you for your time today, and we'll see you next time on What the Orbit.